He had beheaded queens, executed friends, burned priests, tore apart a nation, just to feed his will. Henry VIII ruled with steel fear and divine conviction. But then he ran out of enemies. No more wives to discard, no more traitors to hang, no more rivals to silence. And that's when it began. The body that once dazzled in tournaments began to rot from the legs up. His once feared presence now reeked of death. Courtiers avoided his chambers. Servants gagged at the smell. His legs oozed pus. His throne had to be hoisted with ropes. The King of England had become a prisoner in his own flesh. They say his coffin burst open before it reached the tomb, that his decaying body leaked onto the church floor, and dogs licked up the royal blood beneath the altar. This is not fiction. This is how one of the most powerful kings in history came undone not by war nor rebellion, but by the weight of his own sins. So what really happened when King Henry VIII had no one left to kill? And why did his final days become the most grotesque chapter in English royal history? This is the story of power, pride, decay, and a death no one dared to imagine. Before the stench, before the screams, before the rot, there was a prince. Henry VIII was not born a monster. In fact, he was everything a Renaissance king was meant to be: handsome, athletic, educated, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in music, theology, politics, and war. He was quite simply dazzling. When he ascended the throne in 1509 at the age of 17, England celebrated. He was young, vibrant, and charismatic, a welcome contrast to his calculating father, Henry VII. People called him the Golden Prince. Artists painted him like a god. Courtiers praised his strength and grace. And for a while, it looked like England might enter a new golden age. But Henry wasn't just a symbol. He was a man obsessed with legacy and with one word: heir. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, gave him love, devotion, and many pregnancies. But none of the sons survived. Only one child lived, a daughter, Mary. And to Henry, that was failure. As the years dragged on and Catherine aged, Henry grew restless and increasingly paranoid. He came to believe their marriage was cursed by God, that the lack of a male heir was punishment for marrying his brother's widow. And when the Pope refused to grant him a divorce, Henry made a decision that would split Europe in half. He tore England away from the Catholic Church. He declared himself the head of the Church of England, seized monasteries, executed clergy, and redefined the very nature of divine authority. It was a revolution disguised as a love story, because all of it was done for another woman, Anne Boleyn. But Anne didn't give him a son either. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth. And soon after, she gave him a reason to sharpen the axe. Anne was executed in 1536, the first English queen ever beheaded. And with her blood still drying, Henry remarried just days later. That wife, Jane Seymour, gave him what he wanted, a son, Edward. But she died in childbirth, and Henry mourned her like a martyr. He would later call her his only true wife. The marriages continued. The blood continued. The politics became more violent, more paranoid, more personal. Henry wasn't just losing wives. He was losing his humanity. He executed friends like Thomas More. He turned on trusted advisors like Thomas Cromwell. And with each passing year, his temper worsened. His decisions became more erratic. His cruelty more pronounced. But his body, that's where the transformation truly began. In 1536, the same year Anne was executed, Henry suffered a brutal jousting accident. He was thrown from his horse, and his armor crushed his leg. He was unconscious for 2 hours. Some say he was never the same after that. The wound never healed. Over time, it became ulcerated, infected, and foul smelling. Doctors drained it, cauterized it, packed it with wine soaked cloth, but nothing worked. It kept coming back. By the 1540s, Henry was no longer the Golden Prince. He was obese, some say, over 300 pounds. He couldn't walk on his own. His legs swelled and split open. His breath was shallow, his skin pale and slick. He sat on padded thrones hoisted by ropes. His armor had to be custom made to fit his bloated frame. He wore fur-lined coats year-round to mask the smell, and behind every whispered prayer and bowed head was disgust. No one dared speak of it aloud, but everyone knew the king was dying, from the outside in and the inside out. And with no more wives left to discard, no more enemies left to silence, no more blood left to spill, Henry VIII was finally left alone with himself. The year was 1541. Henry VIII no longer resembled the king who once danced in golden halls. He no longer rode horses. He could barely walk. His face, once sharp and proud, had become doughy and red. His eyes distant, his voice short-tempered. His very presence, once electrifying, now hung over the court, like the stench from his rotting legs. And yet, no one could look away, because even as his body decayed, his wrath grew sharper. The court was silent around him. No one laughed unless he laughed first. No one sat unless he gave permission. No one dared correct him, not even physicians who feared their advice might be interpreted as treason. Each morning it took several men to dress him. They had to bind his leg ulcers in linen-lifting folds of infected flesh away from bone. Sometimes the king screamed. Other times he said nothing at all, just stared at the floor, mumbling words no one understood. He still ruled, but not like before. Now Henry ruled by dread. He had surrounded himself with flatterers, sycophants, and spies. The court wasn't a palace, it was a minefield. One wrong word could mean arrest. One rumor could end in death. These servants whispered in corridors. Courtiers bowed deeper, but looked over their shoulders as they walked away. Henry trusted no one, not his nobles, not his wives, not even his own children. He had declared both Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate at different times, only to later restore them when politically useful. He had created a son, Edward, through Jane Seymour, and pinned all his hopes on the boy. But Edward was sickly, frail, not the robust heir Henry imagined, and Henry began to realize he might never live long enough to see his son rule. The thought drove him mad. In 1542, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. She was young, barely 17. He called her his rose without a thorn. He lavished her with gifts, poems, jewels. But behind the velvet smile, Catherine had secrets. Rumors surfaced, whispered confessions, intercepted letters. She had known other men before Henry, and perhaps she still loved one of them. When he found out, Henry did not shout. He did not scream. He collapsed. Witnesses say he sat in silence for hours, unable to speak, and when he rose, his eyes were hollow. Catherine was dragged from court, shrieking. "I am the Queen of England," she cried, clawing at walls. She begged for her life, begged to see Henry one last time. He refused. She was executed at the Tower of London, just like Anne Boleyn. Some say she asked to rehearse her beheading the night before, laying her head on a block of wood to prepare herself. She was 18. Henry meanwhile returned to his chambers. He did not mourn. He did not speak of her again. But something had shifted. He now avoided mirrors. He no longer attended court unless absolutely necessary. He signed papers from bed, often delirious from infection. His leg now had to be lanced daily. The pain made him irritable, even violent. He accused servants of stealing ministers, of plotting even his last wife, Catherine Parr, of heresy. She barely escaped execution. Had she not flattered him one last time, praising his wisdom, calling herself his humble student, she too might have lost her head. The court had learned one thing: you could not reason with a man in agony. In his final years, Henry was more shadow than sovereign. He could no longer lead in battle. He no longer wrote poetry. He barely appeared in public. His own people whispered he had become a living corpse. Some even believed he was cursed, that the blood of his wives, friends, and advisers was rotting him from within. And in some twisted way, they were right. This was a man who had executed the mother of his daughter and watched that daughter rise in the shadows. This was a man who had destroyed his enemies, only to be left alone with a court full of cowards and opportunists. This was a man who had made himself king and god, and now not even God wanted to be near him. One foreign ambassador described him this way: "The king is a mountain of flesh, sweating, groaning, and terrifying. He is obeyed, yes, but not loved." Inside the walls of Whitehall, the atmosphere was silent, like waiting for a storm to finally break. But no thunder came, no war, no rebellion, just waiting, waiting for the king to die. And in 1547, after years of pus paranoia and pain, Henry VIII finally began to fade, not with glory, not with ceremony, but with gurgled breaths in a darkened chamber and the sound of flies buzzing around the festering throne. In the winter of 1546, the royal palace stank of rot. Behind closed doors and thick curtains, Henry VIII lay dying, not in a blaze of triumph, nor surrounded by mourning nobles, but in silence, a silence so thick, so careful, it almost felt like fear, because no one dared speak the truth. The King of England was decomposing while still alive. The ulcers on his legs had deepened, gaping wounds filled with pus and decay. Surgeons cut them open daily, sometimes twice a day, packing them with herbs, wine-soaked linen, and even crushed pearls. Nothing helped. The smell was overwhelming. His skin blackened. His feet swelled like drowned wood. Henry could no longer walk, stand, or even shift without pain. His body had become a prison of suffering. And yet his mind, though blurred by fever, still clung to power. He continued to sign death warrants, continued to send messages to ambassadors, continued to pretend that the end wasn't coming. But his council knew better. They watched his breathing grow shallower, his sentences shorten, his sleep stretch into days. Some claimed they heard him speak to people who weren't there. Ghosts, perhaps, wives, friends, rivals long since executed. One servant claimed he heard Henry mutter Anne Boleyn's name just once, then go quiet again. As his body failed, the politics around him sharpened. Who would succeed him? Edward the Boy King. He was barely 9, sickly small, and already coughing blood. The nobles circled like vultures. Deals were made in corridors, papers forged, promises whispered in candlelight. And in the center of it all lay Henry, bloated, gasping, dying. By January 1547, he was unable to speak above a whisper. His doctors pleaded for confession, for spiritual absolution. He refused. He never repented, never said he was wrong, not for the wives, not for the executions, not for the wars or the church he shattered. To the very end, he believed himself chosen by God. And so, in a dark chamber in Whitehall Palace, surrounded not by family or friends, but wary courtiers and scent-masked servants, Henry VIII died. No thunder cracked, no saints wept, no choir sang. The king simply stopped breathing. The news was kept secret for days. The court feared unrest. The people had to believe he still lived, if only for a moment longer. But eventually the bell tolled. The lion was dead. And then came the final horror. His body, swollen with gas and rot, was placed in a lead-lined coffin. The procession to Windsor took days. During the journey, his body swelled further. The casket creaked, cracked, then burst. Royal fluids, blood bile decay leaked from the base of the coffin. The stench was unbearable. Eyewitnesses wrote that dogs were seen licking the dripping gore from the church floor beneath the coffin, just beneath the altar. A king's blood on sacred ground. They buried him next to Jane Seymour, the one wife he claimed to truly love. But she had died young before she could disappoint him. He had killed or divorced the others. No monument was ever finished. No majestic tomb carved. The spot where Henry VIII lies today is beneath the floor of St. George's Chapel, marked by a simple stone. No statue, no towering message, just a name, a date, a silence, and that silence says everything. Here lies the man who declared himself supreme head of the church, who sent thousands to their deaths, who changed the course of a nation, and yet died in agony, alone, unforgiven. His reign ended not with a final act of greatness, but with the slow, humiliating erosion of everything he had built. Power couldn't save his body, faith couldn't ease his soul, and history did not weep for him. In the end, Henry VIII was not murdered, overthrown, or cursed by prophecy. He was consumed by his own appetite for control, for obedience, for domination. He died exactly as he lived, commanding fear and drowning in it. They buried him, and for a time, silence. No grand eulogy, no final procession of weeping nobles. No voice cried out to declare, "Here lies a great king," because even in death, Henry VIII made the world uncomfortable. How do you mourn a man who murdered his wives? How do you honor a ruler who tore down centuries of faith just to serve his desire? The truth is, they didn't. The tomb designed for him, massive, golden, magnificent, was never finished. His resting place became an afterthought, a blank stone in a chapel corner. No statue, no Latin inscription, just the weight of his deeds, pressing down through time. And yet his shadow never really left. Henry VIII didn't just change England, he fractured it. His split from the Catholic Church created a new national identity, the Church of England, but it also left generations divided. His obsession with heirs destabilized the monarchy. His tyranny planted seeds of fear that would bloom for decades. His children, Mary Elizabeth and Edward, would inherit not just the crown, but the trauma he left behind. Mary burned Protestants at the stake in a desperate attempt to reverse her father's reforms. Edward, though briefly king, was too sick to finish anything he started. And Elizabeth would become the greatest monarch England ever had. The irony is cruel. Anne Boleyn, the wife Henry, beheaded the woman branded a witch and traitor, gave birth to the only Tudor ruler history truly admires. Elizabeth I reigned longer than her father. She ushered in an age of exploration art and political stability. She resisted marriage and ruled with cunning and died with her people's love. Henry killed Elizabeth's mother. Yet it was Elizabeth who repaired the throne, and it is her golden image we remember, not his. Centuries have passed, and still the fascination with Henry VIII remains, not because he was beloved, not because he was wise, but because he stands as a warning, a living portrait of what power without limits becomes. He reminds us that fear can build empires, but it cannot preserve them. That a man can name himself supreme head and still be consumed by the very throne he worships. And that even kings, the greatest of them, rot like anyone else. Henry VIII ruled through fear, but in the end, fear was all he had left. His wives are gone, his power turned to dust. His body lies beneath a stone, barely anyone notices. But his story still whispers in the walls of history. And if you thought this was terrifying, wait until you meet his son, Edward VI, the boy king who was never strong enough to rule and may have been killed before he ever had the chance to grow up. Another crown, another silent death, another royal secret buried beneath velvet and stone. Click here to uncover what they never told you about Edward VI and the quiet, chilling tragedy that followed Henry's throne. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because the Tudors aren't done with you yet.